Hmm.
Okay, cool. Sorry. Hi, my name is Han. I'm a current graduate student at Johns Hopkins University as well, also in the Department of Functional Anatomy and Evolution. I'm a recent graduate of Stony Brook University, where I worked under Dr. Carrie Mongol and Dr. Frederick Grein, as well as with the Stony Brook University Hospital and Dr. Stephen Nash doing illustrations, as well as working with the Turkana Basin Institute and Leakey Foundation on outreach. I do anatomical illustration for medical school textbooks and forensics, as well as anatomical and osteological sciences concerning human evolution. And I'm currently working on research concerning matrix algebra and coding with respect to evolutionary patterns in primate dentition. And I'm happy to be here. Thank you, Mason.
Awesome. It's a little bit of a juggling act. Okay. So, yeah. So yeah. As I'm hoping most of you know, Kenya is a country in East Africa, which is abutted by several other countries, including Tanzania, Uganda, Sudan, and several of those countries. Yeah, kind of stuck. So you might have to go without seeing Han, unfortunately, those in the room. Um, but it's an extremely diverse place with 69 different languages, more than 69 different languages, and 42 different ethnic groups, and all stuck together in this area that's drawn up mostly in colonial times, the boundaries. Um, and so it's a place that has an incredible amount of different cultures and different ways of doing things. Yeah. Yeah, I don't know what's up with that. But in addition to the diversity of cultures there's also an extremely diverse topographical landscape. There is the East African Rift Valley runs straight through the country. There's East African highlands, and there's lowlands, and there's Lake Victoria and Lake Turkana and several other African Great Lakes. And the equator runs just about here, which has led to an extreme diversity in climates as well. There's everything from tropical rainforests to deserts to polar tundras to temperate places that would remind you of Scotland to savannas that cross the whole country. You can get basically all types of temperatures in one place, which is really cool in my opinion. So now I will turn it over to Han, and now let's see if I can make everyone in the room here. So Han, if you want to talk.
Oh, yeah, sure. So our journey started with a very long flight, emphasis on very. This was actually my first flight since coming to the US, so that was very fun for me. A nice, welcoming 14-hour flight right next to Mason and another stranger beside us. He was very nice though, so that was good.
Yeah, for everyone who couldn't hear in the room. Yeah, it was a very, very long flight, 13 hours direct. And it was Han's first international flight since coming to America. Um, and this is actually also Han, isn't it? So let me.
I will wait a moment.
You're good. You're good.
I'm good. Everything sounds okay. Okay, awesome. So over here we have a photo of the National Museum of Kenya. And just to give you a little bit of background on that, in 1910, a group of naturalists known as the East Africa and Uganda Natural History Society, so a natural history society much like this one, which they're currently known as the East African Natural History Society or the EANHS, they needed a place to sort of store their fossils and stuff like that. And they constructed a place to put them. At the time, the colonial government, which they were under, constructed like a space at a place called Museum Hill in 1930, which they named Corendon Museum, which was after Sir Robert Corendon, who was the colonialist governor of Kenya at the time. Upon gaining independence in the 1960s, it was renamed the National Museum of Kenya, or the NMK. And then in 2008, it was named the Nairobi National Museum, and it is now part of a greater system of museums. Um, while we were there, we mainly focused on looking at the Cradle of Humankind gallery, which is sort of an exhibit on evolution in stone tools. It contained various casts of hominins and lithics and a lot of nice background information on that sort of thing. There's also a gallery on mammals and the story of mammals in the area. It focused on like locomotion and evolution of local fauna. And there's a gallery on the history of Kenya, which focused on language groups, the pre-colonial period, the colonial period, and interaction among the communities, as well as their struggle for independence and independence. There's also an online database on their website if you are interested in heading over there to look for any resources to learn more about this sort of thing. And then over there, we have a photo of Mason standing behind a cast of Proconsul africanus, which was an ape, which lived from around 23 to 14 million years ago during the Miocene epoch. Leakey's team is accredited with finding Proconsul. However, it was Heselon McCreary specifically who was a member of the team who found it. He was the first like real Kenyan to have a permit to excavate, as they were only given out to white colonial anthropologists beforehand. And he was also a really major force in forming the Leakey's work and is responsible for a lot of findings and work that the Leakeys are often purely credited for.
There you So after our time in Nairobi, we took what felt brief in comparison to the plane ride of 5 hour bus ride all the way up to Impala, which is in the Impala Research Center, which is in Laikipia County. It's a place which is mostly concerned with the savannah and the safaris there. But as we went, we crossed the equator, which is always a cool experience if you've never done it before. Obviously, I did it in a plane, but it was cool to stand at the center of the earth, as it were. So in Laikipia, what's kind of cool about the mixed savanna is that it kind of reminds you of the environment which our ancestors probably arose in. Places where there's a bunch of trees around, but there's also a lot of space in between them. So it's a perfect place for something like an ape which lived in a tree to have to come down and walk between the trees or walk to find the carcasses of animals or different food all around. And it was really cool to kind of be experiencing what the fossils were experiencing. And you can actually see on a clear day, and we climbed up a mountain here called Mu Kenya. And on top of Mu Kenya, we saw Mount Kenya. And Mount Kenya is an incredibly tall mountain. It actually is one of the places that has that polar tundra on top. It's really crazy to see in person because around Maryland, we don't got mountains like that. So that was pretty cool. And you can see me trying to take pictures of some sort of animal and not living in the moment like I should have, like the child I am. You can speak now?
We saw a very good amount of animals while we were there, obviously. Also really quickly, Mason, I just wanted to check that your screen is shared with the Zoom call.
Yep.
I think that there might be a little bit of an issue with it coming up as like a pinned thing for some people. Just so you know. But on the top left over here, or at least my top left, the bird sort of looking creature, that is a vulturine guinea fowl. There are a lot of those around the area. We saw a good number of baboons as well, which are on the bottom, maybe a little harder to see. So if you see that picture that looks just like a huge expanse of land, just know that there are some specks that are baboons present. The deer-looking creature is called a dik-dik, and it is essentially just a very tiny deer. They were everywhere. They really liked following me around sometimes, and I loved them. Right next to the dik-dik, there's a hyrax. They were also pretty much everywhere, very cute. And there are a lot of signs on all the buildings saying, do not let the hyrax in. But with that face, I wanted to let him in so bad. And then we have elephants and giraffes. And then over there, there's sort of in the background of the giraffe photo, there's a zebra, which is not just like the general zebra that people might think of, but it is a Grevy zebra or an imperial zebra. It's actually the largest living equid and also among the most threatened of the three species of zebra. It's found in parts of Kenya and Ethiopia, and they sort of have mule-like and larger, more circular, sort of like almost Mickey Mouse ears. And despite sort of like a handful of zoos and parks around the world, like having some sort of successful captive breeding programs for them, in its native home, the zebra is listed as endangered, and the population has declined from 15,000 to 2,000 since the 1970s, with some of the last ones existing within Impala. And then there was just a bunch of hyenas as well. We would sit in our tents at night and just sort of hear their laughter far away, waiting for them to come get us. So that was a bit ominous.
And fun fact, I made the mistake one time when I was young of going to a zoo with hyenas and putting my hand in because I thought they were laughing and smiling because they were friends. They were not, and they tried to bite my hand off. So here's a picture of the short flight that we took from Laikipia all the way up to Lake Turkana, which is in the extreme north of the country. And it starts in Laikipia with this lush green area, especially as you got towards the rim of the Great Rift Valley. And it had just rained there for the first time in I think 2 years. It had some failed wet seasons. So it was just beautiful and lush and gorgeous. And then you cross over this escarpment, which is kind of in the background here. And then you go into the Rift Valley and it just changes dramatically almost immediately. This bone dry desert. The only vegetation that you can see in the area is in these dry riverbeds, which they call lagas. I don't actually know if that's like a Swahili word or if that's a Turkana word, but they're called lagas by everyone who's there. And they're kind of like in between an arroyo and a wadi, if you think about it in terms of size, although they have quite a range. In terms of the geology that created this, it's just two plates that are pulling apart, like that created the Atlantic Ocean, or like almost split Frederick County in two during the Triassic. And there are volcanoes along the side, like Mount Kilimanjaro and others. And then in the middle, we have the series of lakes that kind of expand and contract as the climate changes over time, which is what's preserving those fossils throughout the history of the fault. And the unfortunate thing about the fault is, first of all, the running water kind of disarticulates most of the fossils. So it's very, very rare to find a complete fossil, even rarer than in other places in the world. And while the volcanoes are leaving layers of datable tuffs and ashes that we can take and radiometrically date and say exactly how old they are, this complex faulting activity that's happening on the sides and in the middle is really confusing. It jumbles up the geography, so it's taken decades and decades and decades of geological work to figure out exactly how old the fossils are in exactly each place. And it's kind of a necessity to have a geologist with you when you go there. So yeah, I forgot to put the little things which say what I just said. If you'd like. And so when we got to Turkana, we stayed in a little place called TBI Turkwell, which is the Turkana Basin Institute's site in the area it was affiliated with Stony Brook University. So that's how I got to go there, part of the school and also part of the field research there. It's on the outskirts of a little village called Nakachi and it's on the west side of the lake. There's a bunch of sites on the east side of the lake. You can see over here, Kubifora being the one that's the most famous of them. But the sites range all the way from the Cretaceous when the dinosaurs were alive, all the way up to the Holocene. There's a bit of a gap in between, but we have Oligocene, we have beautiful resolution in the Miocene, a slight skip into the Pleistocene. But it's really, there are a few places on this planet where you have such a continuous record of life on this planet, which is really, really incredible. I also forgot to say that TBI Turkwell is on a ephemeral river that had been dry for a year or two, but since it had just rained, was in full force. It was only a foot or two deep, but it's one of those big wide rivers, and it actually starts all the way up in Uganda. This lake is a brackish lake, so you can't drink it, but it has no outflow, but it has several inflows. The big one being the Omo River up in Ethiopia, but some of these smaller ones feed into it as well. So this is what it looked like where we landed. Now, granted, it is the airstrip, but you can tell that there's basically no vegetation. The heat kind of hits you immediately. It's about 100 degrees every day. It's about maybe 78 degrees at night, I would say. Maybe Han can correct me when they come on. But we took the short drive about an hour from the airstrip to the camp, and you can see since it just rained, it was in full bloom with a bunch of plants around, and you can see the Turkwell River in the background. Very, very beautiful place to watch the sunset, especially with the sunsets on the equator are always more pretty because of the way it works. Sun, I don't really understand it, but it's cool. You can talk now, huh? Oh wait, no, this is me. Oh my gosh. The Turkana people, I want to talk about briefly the people who live in the area. And they came down about 300 to 400 years ago, according to their oral traditions and also according to genetics and archaeology. So they've lived there for quite a while. A lot of people in Kenya, not just the Turkana, but they'll wear t-shirts and jeans and shorts and such, but they'll many of them will also wear this thing called a kukoi, which is kind of an all-purpose cloth, which is often used as a kilt or as a shawl. Keeps the sun off you, but also keeps the air flowing, which is nice. The great thing about Turkana is that even though it's very hot, it's bone dry, and there's always a breeze. So it's nice to have a garment which works with that. A lot of people live in these manyata or thatched houses and homesteads, which are have basically large perimeters of thatch around them as well. Although if you go to the cities, obviously they're living in more permanent structures. They're traditionally a semi-nomadic people, raising goats and in the past cows, and you can still see some camels and donkeys around as well. That's their main source of livelihood, and it's a great way of extracting nutrients out of a very rough environment. They can turn the plants that we can't eat into something that's edible, their milk and their meat. And when the men get to puberty, they are given a kichalong or a stool or headrest. They use it in several ways. They carry around with them, fashioned by their families, and they also carry around a shepherd's stick. And that's how you reach manhood, is when you get these two items and can take care of the flock. All that.
So a typical day at TVI involved waking up within the communally shared room, trying to get out of your mosquito net without letting any mosquitoes in, failing a lot of the time, and then having to go back into your mosquito net and chase it around a little bit, like a Tom and Jerry-esque manner, trying to get it out again, and then waking up and going to eat breakfast. We had a tea time, which was honestly really nice, and I feel like I should probably implement it back like into my life now. But we drank a lot of tea there, and we played with our dog there named Tupac. He was a wild dog, and he was very nice, although he had a little bit of like a biting problem. I still loved him though. I couldn't really be mad at him. He would bite me. I'd be like, "You're so cute. This is fine." And then I'd be bleeding a little bit, but it's okay. You had to drink around like 4 liters of water a day because it was like intensely hot, and we'd be doing a lot of field work a lot of the time. So it's really important to stay hydrated. Mason did a really good job at that. I am not a water drinker. I would drink maybe 1.5 liters on a good day, and then Mason would like yell at me. He'd be like, "What are you doing?" I'd be like, "I'm sorry." But word of advice: if you go to the field, keep up on that water, or you'll regret it. A lot of field safety rules actually that I did not follow as I should have probably. So sunscreen, water, long pants, hats, a must.
So also part of our daily lives there was food, obviously. There was some great food there. The bananas are very tiny. People rave about them. They tasted normal to me, but maybe to the more complex palate, it's different. Lovely oxtail soup. Han's vegetarian, so they don't eat it, but it was very delicious. Ugali, which is kind of like grits, but it's a little bit more substantial. And then there's kuchimbari, which is kind of their answer to pico de gallo. Mandazi, lovely fried dough, and chapati shows kind of the influence of the Indian subcontinent. The British were bringing along a lot of people from there. And the local sodas are delicious, and you cannot find them in the U.S. anywhere. There's Crest, which is like a bitter lime drink, and then there's a Stony Tangawizi, which is it's kind of like halfway between a ginger beer and a ginger ale. And also these little peppers, which you never know if it's going to be the hottest pepper you've ever had in your life, or if you won't be able to taste it at all. Basically the researcher who had brought their own hot sauce was king, and everyone would try to steal it from them because it was in short supply. They also had this lovely condiment on the table known as sauce, Sunfresh brand sauce, which had the ambiguous ingredients vegetable pulps, edible starches, and food spices. So who knows what is actually in it, but it didn't taste very good in my opinion, but I don't know, each their own. Now you can, oh, actually, is this me as well? So this is basically just right outside of camp. There are fossils you can find, which is nice. You can go out on a morning walk and look for fossils in this Pliocene sediment from when the lake was at a greater extent. At that point, they called it Lake Lonyman, combined with several lakes in the area. And you can find lots of cool stuff, which I believe Han's going to tell you about.
Yeah, so for a few days we went out to that exact area and we surveyed for fossils. It looks a lot like how you might survey for fossils around you. We'd go around, we'd walk around, we'd look really closely at the ground, pick up anything. And then we'd call over whoever is most equipped to maybe assess it. I know Mason and I are more well versed in maybe topics of like zoo arc and stuff, but we had someone there named Medina who was even more well versed, and something that maybe I thought was a rock, she'd be like, actually, this is like a tiny piece of like a vertebra. And I'd be like, that's amazing. Very hot out though, so once again, drinking all the water. That's actually me walking on a very large hill. It is not, in fact, a Bigfoot spotting, but it is me walking on a huge pile of rock. The only thing about it is if you were to find something, you would just leave it there, as you should, since a lot of that stuff was meant to stay, not just in Kenya, but in that exact area where you found it. There were a lot of people in the area at the time for a lot of different reasons. There were some people filming a documentary, actually. I think they were from the UK, and they went to an area which is considered sort of like a sacred area. And it was in a place called Lothagum, which is where some of the sites are. And they took a bunch of rocks and pocketed them, and then came back to base and were like, "Hey, kid, look at these rocks." And then they went to the airport with the rocks in their carry-on, and they probably got in a lot of trouble. So there's a cautionary tale about taking rocks.
Yeah, you do not want to end up in a Kenyan jail. Not fun, so I hear. So in that area, you find a bunch of things. There's actually, you could find a stingray tooth or a stingray barb if you're lucky. It was connected briefly to the Indian Ocean. So there's a species of freshwater stingray that used to live there. Doesn't anymore. There's also stromatolites, which you might know from older deposits, microbial mats, which basically live in very shallow, very warm water, as well as a bunch of crocodilian material. It's literally everywhere. It's today still Lake Turkana is the highest population of Nile crocodiles in the world. But back then was no different. The great diversity of crocodilians, and like people here are super happy when they go down to Calvert Cliffs and they find some crocodile material. But up there, if you find it, you usually just leave it on the ground, and it'll probably be there next year. You could also see stone tools literally everywhere. Because of something that happens there, a little less so here, but with the sand, it blows away and it leaves the artifacts and the fossils all kind of in one area. So the time resolution isn't always great. So you can have stone tools that are 3.3 million years old, or you could have stone tools that were made 100 years ago and you wouldn't really know it. But they just litter the ground because there's not as much vegetation. You can see them all right there, like these obsidian flake up there, some quartz flake, and a quartz core that was just outside of camp. They're just everywhere, and it's kind of crazy. It feels really cool to be walking over history like that.
So while we were there, we got the pleasure of going into sort of the fossil vaults and getting shown some things that they had found recently, some which have been yet to be described. So obviously no photos. So first we have the titanosaurs, which right there, there's a fossil, which was from the area, Turkana. It was a sauropod dinosaur. They were one of the last surviving groups of long-necked sauropods, actually, and it was still thriving at the time of the Great Extinction event at the end of the Cretaceous period. In the middle, we have an Azhdarchid pterosaur, and they were sort of known primarily from the late Cretaceous period, though an isolated vertebra was found, which was apparently from one of them, although not 100% confirmed, and that was from the early Cretaceous. But since that was just sort of a fragmentary piece, um, who's to say? And then we have the Belosaur, which is a theropod dinosaur, and it also lived during the Cretaceous period, and it lived on the ancient southern supercontinent of Gondwana. And yeah, it was just really cool to see like the variety and diversity of things that could be found in the area. It was a really awesome experience to get to see the vaults.
And the next I'm speaking about a site that's close to my heart because this is the site that the fossil I had been studying for about 3 years. But just the CT scan of it came from this site, and it was really cool to visit it. It's a place called Napadet. So TBI Turkwell is on the river here, and it's about an hour, 2 hour drive down to Napadet. It's a mountain range, and the fossils there are primarily, at least the ones we're looking at, from the Miocene epoch. Actually almost exactly contemporaneous with the ones at Calvert Cliffs, especially in the Calvert and Choptank formations. They have these columnar basalts, which is what helped us date the site. And the site the fossil I'm looking at is from this little mound, aptly named Red Hill, not to be confused with the one in Pennsylvania. But it's we're basically taking down the entire hill, and there's thousands and thousands of microfossils in this little area. And in Napadet, not exactly on Red Hill, but there's been a bunch of really cool ancient ape fossils. This is right around the time when apes are diversifying and becoming our ancestors. So it is a very important site for that, including the most complete cranium, one of the most complete craniums ever found of an ape, and the only infant ape that's been found with a complete skull, found by this man, John Akusi, who was kind enough to take us out there. Akusi found this while going out for a cigarette break, found it on the ground. And it was an incredible find. He named it Alesi, which in Turkana means ancestor. And we've named the species Neanthropithecus alesi. There's also Popeye. Popeye was found by the late great Dr. Isaiah Nengo. He died pretty recently, but he was also a Kenyan researcher. And he on the hill they found it. They call it Hallelujah Hill because he found it. He went Hallelujah because he was happy he found it. And it's a complete or a fairly complete postcrania of a ape from the Miocene, which shows us a lot about how they moved and locomoted. These are probably different species of ape, but the ape fossils keep coming, so it's really, really cool for that. But what I'm interested in is a little different. So there's petrified trees all over the place, including this one on the ground. This one's still standing up, which you can see me next to. So we know that it was a forest. It happens during the Middle Miocene transition, just like the Calvert cliffs, and which is really cool because it's the last time that we had a major warming event and then a major cooling event right after it. The fauna in Africa changes completely. And there's also some geological events going on at the same time. So we're really trying to investigate what's going on. And Turkana Basin is really cool because it has this really great resolution in the Miocene on the land site, which is pretty rare. And this is also the time when apes spread throughout the world. Like I said, they were diversifying, but during the Middle Miocene climactic optimum, they get all the way up to Europe, and they're actually pretty common up in Europe, and they spread it around to Asia. And today, they're just in a remnant in this kind of band of land in the African rainforest belt, and then in the rainforests down in Southeast Asia. But it's really important for learning about how the great apes came to be and how we came to be, because we came out of this radiation not very long after, around 7 million years ago. But what I'm interested in is the bush babies, which are these lovely little primates that basically no one studies. We know very little about them, or about their fossil history at least. The galagos live today only in sub-Saharan Africa. The lorises are split between Asia and Africa. Although, fun fact, this guy's actually venomous. They like to have venom glands in their armpits, and they will rub their tooth combs on it, their incisors and things. There's a black market trade of these guys as pets, and they cut off their incisors. It's really awful. And that's so that they don't inject you with that venom. But here's hominoids. So this is us and apes, and here's old world monkeys. Here's the monkeys that live in South America. And then there's lemurs, and then here's that kind of forgotten lineage, which is the lorisoids, which is the galagos, the lorises. And I'm studying a fossil from the area that fills a gap, and basically there's no other galago fossils from this time period. There's two at Napadet, and the one that I'm studying is this particular mandible with one little tooth in it that's perfectly preserved. We're using lots of really fancy methods on it, and something that's kind of cool about it is it's really big. It's one of the largest that's ever been found. It's about the same size as the living otolemur, like this very grumpy looking greater galago. So it'd be about that size. And there's a lot of really interesting stuff about it, which hopefully it'll be published soon. Who knows? There's also some other cool stuff. I talk about the primates because I know about them, but there's tons of fossils there, including bear dogs, giant amphicyonid, which you might know is also found in the Calvert Cliffs of Maryland. So it's kind of a cool thing. You can find that in the area. And South Turkwa, I think, Han, did you want to talk about this one, right?
Yes. So the South Turkwa site is located in northern Kenya. It's a Pliocene hominid site, and it's located near the Turkwa River. The site is rich in sort of like fauna, and it dates back to 3.5 million years ago. Some fossils discovered at the site include things like teeth, a mandibular fragment, a phalanx, and a metacarpal, and a few other things. And the fauna associated with the hominid also includes carnivorous specimens, which provide a lot of information for us about sort of early evolution of modern African carnivora. And all of the faunal information found at the site suggests that the environment at South Turkwell was mainly sort of bushland. And South Turkwell also has some remains that were found recently, which will soon be described by my undergraduate advisor, Dr. Carrie Mongol. So keep a lookout for that. It should be really cool.
Yeah, we got to actually see some of the fossils that Hans' advisor is going to describe, and they're really cool. They are very cool. So keep your eye on the news. Since we're running out, since I'm going too slow, I will go very quickly. Australopithecus anamensis is, I'm going through all the hominins that are found in the Turkana Basin of Kenya. Australopithecus anamensis is basically the oldest ape that we know stood up on 2 feet. It's that we're 100% sure, no doubt. This guy is pretty cool. It's been found originally in Kanapoy, which is in the Turkana Basin. Since then, this beautiful skull was found in Ethiopia, which tells us exactly what its face looked like, something like that. Here's Lucy. You know Lucy, but Lucy was actually found in Ethiopia, and it's named after Ethiopia, Afar, the Afar Triangle up in the northern Rift Valley. But it's also been found in Turkana in Kenya. Here's some of the remains. They're not quite as complete as Lucy, although Lucy has no face either. But we found it elsewhere in Ethiopia. But there's not as much of it because there's kind of a gap in the record in Turkana, or at least I think that's when Monument is out, so that's when it's covered in a lake. So you don't tend to find too many upright apes living in the middle of a lake. So that's why we don't see too many of them. Then there's Kenyanthropus platyops, which basically is some people call it squishy pithecus because it's been inundated with water and then dried up, and inundated water dried up. It's basically been exploded by this process. And it was also slightly damaged by the fact that some school kids found it first and wanted to show the paleontologists they knew what they were doing and tried to excavate it a little bit. But it didn't really matter because it's already exploded anyway. So we don't know much about it, but it was found at a place in West Turkana called Lamekwi, which dates to 3.3 million years ago. And that'll become important later. Here's Paranthropus boisei, one of the most well-known hominins from the area, especially from that place I was pointed out, Kubifora. You can see most of these come from Kubifora, which is in Turkana. There's one from West Turkana. Basically, think of a gorilla on 2 legs. That's kind of what we think it was like. Has this incredibly giant cheekbones, this sagittal crest for giant chewing muscles, and big, massive molars. Really, really cool creature that was alive at the time. And the earliest members of our genus, Homo habilis and Homo rudolfensis, found starting 2 million years ago. Who knows if they're the same species? Probably not, but some people argue. But they're really cool because that kind of shows us what our ancestors were like. Something that's kind of cool is these guys, the Homo habilis, tend to have a face that is more like ours, but a brain that's kind of small, whereas the Homo rudolfensis have a face that doesn't really look like ours, but a brain that's pretty big. So who knows what's going on there? It's some weird stuff. And then we have Homo erectus / ergaster. Some people call the African Homo erectus ergaster, and some do not. But at Illiret, over on the other side of the lake, they have these footprints from it, which are pretty cool. There's hand axes all over the place. And then there's on the west side of Turkana, at a place called Nariakademi, was found Nariakademi boy or Turkana boy, which is an almost complete, like 99% complete specimen of Homo erectus, interpreted to be an adolescent male. And it's a truly incredible fossil, one of the best that's ever been found of anything, in my opinion. So I said to remember 3.3 million years ago, and that's because right near Kenyanthropus platyops has been found the oldest stone tools known to man. These stone tools, we got to look at them ourselves and pick them up. So there's me holding one of them. And they were created using something called anvil percussion. So basically, whatever was doing this, who knows if it was Kenyanthropus platyops or something else, was taking a rock and it was hobbling around because they're about this tall and their hands aren't really meant for carrying things. So it hobbled over about a football field, raised it above its head, hit another rock, and did that over and over and over again, creating flakes. And that's basically most of what it did. So we're still learning about it. It's just discovered not too terribly long ago. It's a really cool thing to be able to hold in your hands the origins of technology itself. And that was discovered by, it was actually found by a local guy named Sammy Locarodi, who was out on a team led by Dr. Sonia Harmon, who was actually a former professor of both of us. Sammy brought him up this rock and says, this looks like a stone tool, but it looks a little weird. And she said, I agree, it looks like a stone tool. and it looks very weird, but she said it in a French accent. She is French. So that's kind of, and that's the area where they excavate. The area where they excavate there is all extremely hard rock, so they have to like pick through it for a very, very long time. It's like concrete. So that's sucks for them, I guess. And here is Hans.
So whilst you were there, we participated in a few archaeological excavations at a site called Naquaper 2, which was an early pastoral site and a mortuary ground, as you can see written on the slide. I took part in the bioarchaeological excavations while we were there. Normally, you really don't want to. Sorry, I failed to mention this earlier, but I'm very much involved in bioarchaeology. I don't know how I failed to mention that. But normally, when you are dealing with sort of ancestral burial grounds or any sort of human remains, you want to try to avoid that. And have like very solid relations and communication with the local communities. You don't really want to touch burials or people's sort of ancestral grounds. And mainly bioarchaeologists like to be on the site just in case if something is accidentally sort of stumbled upon and needed to like be handled correctly. We really want to pay attention to sort of these human remains ethics. However, at Naco Parrot 2 was sort of a different case because the team was called in specifically by the local community because there were some human remains which were sort of eroding and already sticking out of the ground. And it was actually in someone's backyard. So they kind of called them up and was like, hey, this is kind of coming out and scaring me a little bit. Can you please take care of this? So we excavated it, brushed around for others. I actually swept a whole beach with a paintbrush and a little pail, as you can see depicted up there. That took a really long time, and I did not wear sunscreen, and it was not a good idea, and it will come back to bite me later, probably. And it is also important to mention that the Turkana came to reside in this area around 300 to 400 years ago. So the people who we were sort of uncovering, who were sticking out of the ground, aren't really people they consider to be their ancestors either. Um, and yes, it was a very hot but very educational experience in ethics and site ethics. Over here, we just have some photos of the team who we worked with and who led the project. If you're really interested in sort of bioarchaeological ethics and methods, I really suggest looking at Dr. Yvette Salchuk's work, especially. She established a lot of the standards that people like to follow now. So if you want to check that paper out, I would just really recommend searching her name. And the person from Stony Brook University who sort of mainly brought us there was Dr. Elizabeth Hildebrand. She is one of our former professors as well, and she is also very wonderful when it comes to ethics. So here's a photo of Mason sort of using something called a total station, and we would go down centimeter by centimeter or sometimes inch if we were lucky, and we would dig different levels. And at each level, we would have to do a bunch of paperwork, and every single artifact, whether it was a little fragment of bone or a piece of pottery, we would leave where it was, and then we'd use the total station to record exactly where it was and what level and position. And this is all digitally recorded within a 3D space. And then later, these items were put away and then cataloged. And once again, even more paperwork was filled out.
So like the last site that I'm going to talk about is a place called Lothgum, which is an incredible place. We mentioned it earlier. It's basically these two parallel basalt ridges that rise from the landscape. And it's really, really, it's almost awe-inspiring when you first see it jutting out of the landscape. And it has kind of like it has like a vibe to it, is that's the way I put it. Some people think it's kind of scary. Some people think that it's just kind of awe-inspiring. There's a superstition in the area that if your livestock eats on the peaks of the ridge, you should slaughter them because they're going to die anyway. They've been cursed. And it really does have a feeling there, which I know sounds strange, but it feels different when you're there. And we camped out there for 2 days in the vicinity. And something that was ever present in the camp was these Nairobi flies, which are actually a type of beetle, which are fine if they're crawling all over you. It's okay. You just have to brush them off very gently because if you swat them, their insides are corrosive and they stop your cells from being able to produce DNA, which gives you a nasty scar for about a month. That hurts quite a bit. Yeah, but it's actually been used for anti-cancer research recently, which is kind of cool. But these weaving lagas kind of go through the area inside. It's funny because it's like low outside, but inside it's raised, and they have these canyons going through it, and you can kind of walk through time in this sort of Martian landscape. The Miocene there is really interesting because it's about 7 million years old, which is right when our ancestors were diverging from chimps. And who knows if maybe in the future something's going to be announced there that's pretty cool. But there's also a incredible amount of hippos and crocodiles and turtles and elephants just lying all around the place. It's really cool when you come from a place like this where we're all looking for like one little shark tooth, and then you step out there and there's just bones everywhere. It's incredible. I'm interested in the primates, obviously. There's a bunch of baboons that have been found there, as well as some apes or possibly hominins, kind of unsure. But since they've only found the teeth, the person who drew it, Mauricio Anton, who's a great artist, but elected to only draw the face. And I think it's kind of funny. I don't know. And you can see these little rhizoliths around. We don't have as many paleosols around here, but that's just fossilized soils. And they're filled in with the roots of the plants have filled in, and we call those rhizoliths. You can see them all around. It's also got Pliocene right on top of the Miocene, and that's where you will find more primates like Galetas, which are kind of like baboons but scarier, but also fancier. Saber-toothed cats and crocodiles, and a few hominins as well, Australopithecus of some variety. And then we get into Locom, which is a beautiful place, which is kind of in the middle of Lothagum where it just turns white. And it's white because it's got all these crushed shells in it. This was the edge of the lake during the African humid period when the hunter-fisher gatherers were living there and leaving lots and lots and lots of harpoons made out of bone, which is really cool. There's also some burials and remains around there. Speed up. Here is the extent of the lake is that red. And Lothagum, you can see, was just this spit of land going out there with these two black ridges rising out of the lake and a lagoon inside. Must have been insane to look at. And the thing that's most awe-inspiring is these stone pillars and circles which surround which are dotted throughout Lothagum and also around the lake. But the biggest one is located in Lothagum at the northern end. It's called Lothagum North. And the one they had excavated on the other side of the lake, they only found some artifacts, so they went in to do it on this one, and then they hit remains. They hit incredible amounts of human remains. So they stopped, but they created an estimation of what they found, and there are hundreds of people entombed in this giant thing, which is basically they've dug out the sandstone bedrock, which is extremely hard. They've placed over generations many people in there with many grave goods. Doesn't seem to be any sort of disparity in wealth or in gender or anything like that, but they have some people with like headdresses with thousands of gerbil teeth and semi-precious stones, and it's incredible. They've covered that with sandstone blocks, basically, and then on top of that, they put columnar basalts into stone circles on top of it. It was an incredible feat, which is crazy because you never hear about it. You hear about Stonehenge, but this is, in my opinion, pretty cool, much cooler. So you're sitting there, and it's just you have such an awe for the people who lived there who put this down and said, I was here at one point. There's even a pot there that was interpreted to have been made by a child because it's kind of messed up. So the thought is that maybe the kid could have made that for a relative that passed away and put it down with them. So it's really nice. So I didn't want to take a picture of it because it felt disrespectful. But when you take a picture from it, you can look up and you can see where they got the columnar basalts, and they had to come down this little pathway. So they had to carry it from here, or maybe down here if it fell around here, these 200-pound blocks, and hustle them over to the other side, which must have been quite a feat. And from up on that hill, you can see the area where the lake is today, which is right here. And it would have come all the way down here, and they would have known that they probably would have known it was receding if they'd been there a few generations, because the African human period was ending. And these people were also the first pastoralists in the area, so they were the first people to bring their goats and their cows. And I'll let Han here for the next part. They're going to be human. They're going to be bones here. If you're in this room, you see lots of bones and carcasses anyway, so it's not going to be crazy. But you don't want to look at it. You don't have to for the next.
Yeah, so speaking of climate change, global climate change has increased sort of the intensity of droughts. They just went through an extremely long period of drought recently. And the UN was basically like, you guys aren't taking care of the land properly. So an initiative arose where they introduced a plant called mesquite in order to combat the aridification. However, it caused worsened famines as the local sort of herds of goats and sorts, which is their livelihood and also like sort of what they were living off of, would eat it. But since it was so sweet, it would rot their teeth and it would cause the death of a lot of different sort of it would cause the death of a lot of their I cannot remember the word, I'm so sorry. it would cause the death of a lot of their goats and stuff and sorts. And it just caused a much worse situation than they would have initially had. Um, Due to the recent construction of a hydroelectric dam on the Omo in Ethiopia, it raised fears of reduced levels of the lake, and it also somehow sort of dramatically rose the levels of the lake, which ended up destroying a lot of homes in villages in their entirety and killing a lot of flocks and destroying a lot of crops and obviously displacing a lot of people. More recently, a financial bill was introduced and it was pushed, and it would have really risen the levels of taxes, which would cause a lot of financial harm to a lot of Kenyan people. And a largely Gen Z driven protest, or multiple, were violently repressed by police forces, shooting into crowds of unarmed youth. A lot of tear gas was used, a lot of people were beaten. There's just a lot of major police violence, a lot of this directed towards students. And there were protests in response to these deaths as well, some of them being held outside of Kenya to call upon justice for those harmed within these protests, which resulted in, and the police violence resulted in over 40 losses of very young lives. Following this, a memorial concert and continued movement, the bill was retracted, and now the president, William Ruto, fired the entire cabinet following the protests, and people are still protesting in order to demand his resignation rather than his continuation of presidency.
So that's it. And I do want to say that mesquite stuff is really bad. It grows really quickly and it sucks up the water. And it, for some reason, all the trees there are acacia trees. They have thorns and they can prick you, but the mesquite thorns, for some reason, cause infection at a much higher rate. We don't really know why. And it just spreads really quickly. It's broken up the land there. It's really bad. But the local people have gotten a little bit of a benefit out of it, in that they've figured out to basically turn it into a charcoal industry. They figured out they can burn it because it grows so fast and turn it into charcoal, which they can sell out. So they're making the best out of a really bad situation. But yeah,
Oh,
that's all I have.
yes,
We thank a bunch of people who contributed in large ways and small ways. And you can contact us anytime if you have any questions. And if you want to see me make stone tools or learn about the geology out in Mount Airy, Maryland, welcome to come out and see me in September. Yeah, that's it. Yeah, so there's a paper on it that people can read if they want to. They have a local word for it. Forgetting what it is. I think it's with the E. But basically, this happened in the 80s, is when it started. There was this big push. Some people might remember it, to talk about aridification, the idea that the desert is spreading in Africa, and in some places it is. But they thought that this was because the local people were not dealing with the environment correctly. Was the line that the UN put out. And so they convinced people, said massive initiatives to start growing this in place of their crops that they had normally been growing, which were things like sorghum, which worked fairly well in their environment. And they started making these mesquite things, putting them down. And they did thrive in the environment, just too much. And they were producing these seeds with a bunch of sugar that were really very bad for the goats. Um, and they sued the UN in court, but the UN has diplomatic immunity, so that was dismissed. So instead, they basically sued the Kenyan government officials who allowed it to happen. The Turkana people did, or a group of Turkana people did, and they won. They got a massive settlement, but there's 2 million people in Turkana, and there's basically no way to stop these plants now. So it's an unfortunate situation. A reminder of how important it is to really make sure you know what you're doing when you're bringing species into a new place, especially in a place where people have lived there for hundreds and thousands of years, different way. Oh yeah. Yeah, so the sediments are laid down mainly the water. So it's switched a few times. There's been points where it was fed by the Nile. It was connected to the Nile. It's not today, but it used to, at one point it was. And that's actually in that Monument member I talked about in the Pliocene. They've got giant Nile perch fossils. I mean, I thought that the tunas fossils we find here were big. You haven't seen a fish till you've seen those Nile perch. They're incredible. But yeah, it's been at previous times connected through the Nile, but it's been connected to the Indian Ocean during the Miocene in particular. They've actually found one beaked whale all the way out in Turkana, which they weren't expecting. It must have swam up the river. So it. I don't think it's due to precipitation. It's mostly due to the geologic uplift over time has cut it off. There was it used to have an outlet at the south portion of the lake. I don't have a picture, but which has it got closed up by volcanics, plugged the south end of the lake, which used to connect it to the Indian Ocean. So that's part of it. It's mostly geologic activity, but climate change has also played a role in when you get into this stuff, you realize climate change and geologic change are connected. They both affect each other, which has been a part of the story. But the lake's been big. It was big in the Miocene, and it was big a few times in the Pliocene. It was big during the African human period in the Holocene. Oh yeah. Yeah, no, that stuff I think is mostly it's just been worn away. The Cretaceous is up in the north in a place called the Grits, and there's only a little bit of it, and that's mostly I think it's mostly marine. I'm not 100% sure on that though. But yeah, then there's Eocene volcanics all over the place, but no sediments that at least have been found. The Oligocene is only a little sliver too. Yeah, yeah. The area for fossils has been investigated since by the French a long time ago, back in the early 1900s, for fossils. But it has the most of the recent stuff is really an effect of Richard Leakey, who is the son of Louis Leakey, who you may have heard of, who found a bunch of fossil things, or really the people he hired in Kenya found a bunch of things in Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania. But Richard was still, kind of figuring out what he wanted to do research-wise. He wasn't a doctor. He passed away 2 years ago. And he was flying. He knew how to fly planes. He was flying a plane over the area, and he saw the rocks, and he said, "That looks pretty good." So he set down camp there, and he researched it his entire life. And then TBI was a collaboration between Richard Leakey and his wife Maeve Leakey, as well as eventually their daughter Louise Leakey, who we got to meet, hang out with. Acacia Leakey's also there, to set up the TBI with Stony Brook University, which is where we went to college. One on the west side, one on the east side of the lake. Yeah, they have a long and complicated history with Kenya, and this is kind of part of their fruition. And it was kind of crazy because he died, and then Dr. Isaiah Nengo died, and then Kamoya Kameyu, who was Richard Leakey's kind of main fossil guy, who found almost all of the fossils we think of when we think of human origins. They all died within the space of a year, which is very strange because they were all different ages. But they're kind of the people who set up the institution as it is today.
Looks like Fred has a question, and hopefully we'll be able to hear him. Fred, go ahead.
Hi, good evening. Mason, can you hear me?
Wait, let me put on the thing for you. There, now you can talk, Fred.
Okay, thanks. So you showed a slide holding a harpoon barb.
Yep.
You said that was found along the lake shore at the time. I was just wondering about how old is that?
So those are from the hunter fisher gatherers. It's from it's associated with pottery called Nderet pottery, about 10,000 years old or older. But they I think are falling mostly around the 13,000 to 10,000 year. I'd have to check to be 100% sure. Han, do you know? You can give me a thumbs up if you do. I'll take that as a no. Oh.
I think that they were like, hmm, wait, I'm sorry. Let me double check because I did have like a communication with someone about this because I emailed someone like after we left like asking a similar question, so let me just continue to dig so that I don't accidentally repeat the wrong thing.
And the other
but
question
first
is,
of all, it's good to hear from you, Fred. I hope you're doing all right.
I am.
Yeah, you
Thank
can
you.
email us and we'll get you the answer if Tom doesn't get it in the next minute.
Yeah,
But
I'm just
it's
curious.
around 10,000 years ago, and that's when it's a little before 10,000 years ago. And 10,000 is the mark when agriculture gets started in the area, and in fact in the world. So yeah, and there's a bunch of you can find those things all around the lake. There's actually a site which is purported to be the earliest warfare that's around that time there, but not so sure about that one. But we got to we looked at those remains as well, and it's yeah, the people were killed in a pretty awful way. They had there's one of them has a obsidian still stuck in the skull after 10,000 years. So there's a lot of really cool archaeology going on around there that is much younger than the stuff that we think about, but is equally cool and equally important for future.
Do you have to leave those artifacts there if you find them?
Do you have any idea on when boundary
So there's well, yeah. So the question was, where's the line between archaeology and paleontology? Now, archaeology is the study of material cultures and residues. So you can have archaeology and paleontology at the same site. That Lamekwi, for example, any fossils or fossil humans you find there is, in theory, paleontology, whereas the stone tools that you find are archaeology. However, it gets a little bit difficult when you get to things like when is something human enough to be considered bioarchaeology or the study of human remains in the archaeological record. And that's a question which is almost a little facetious because there's no one point where we become human. We call Homo habilis human. We call anything in the genus Homo human usually by convention these days, but that's not really a line. In fact, when it was Louis Leakey who expanded the definition of humanity, he made the brain size smaller so he could fit Homo habilis in it, because he thought that if something made tools, it was human. And now if we apply that definition, it goes back 3.3 million years. In fact, it goes back to chimpanzees, and in fact, it goes back to capuchin monkeys and crows would be humans. So yeah, and when the person who found that is a name Jane Goodall, which you may have heard. And when she was actually hired by Louis Leakey to figure that out. And when she figured that out, he said, we're going to either have to change the definition of human or change the definition of tools. So who knows? It's whatever you want. They're human-made words. So yeah. Awesome. And I'll be around if people want to ask questions later. So thank you. And thanks, Han.
I'm just here to tell everyone who's still here that there is a new trip to Centralia that's just been announced. It's going to be led by Tom Farrell on September 28th. That's a Saturday, right? So you should be able to find and register for that on the NHSM homepage. And there's one more club-only Stratford trip coming up on November 9th. And if more stuff is added, I will let you know. But that's all the news from here. So we're going to end this call. Thanks, everybody, for your time. I appreciate you all. See you soon.